Hey friends, you ever find yourself searching for a chilling new horror movie to watch or pining after a new true crime TV series to obsess over? Well, I've got some good news for you, because today's video is sponsored by Likewise. Likewise is an app that helps you find new and incredible stuff to watch, eliminating that tedious process of scrolling through Netflix or Hulu for hours on end, hunting for that new binge-worthy series you just know you're missing out on. Through a mix of smart technology and recommendations from fellow users, the Likewise app is designed to provide you with the best recommendations possible. It's as simple as telling Likewise the kinds of things you're into, and they'll line up personalized lists of stuff you're sure to enjoy. You can join groups to flick through their favorites, peruse a daily trending page to check out what's popular, or even organize lists of things you've picked out, so there's never a wasted moment. And the best thing, the Likewise app is 100% free to use. So, click the link in the description to download the Likewise app now. And if you follow my profile, linked down below, you can even get a chance to check out the movies and shows that I've been enjoying in my spare time. Anyway, on with today's stories. The story took me a while to write, as I'm not much of an author, and this is quite painful for me to relate, but I hope you can fit it in somewhere, as it's something I've wanted to share with you for quite some time. It involves 2 days in my life that I always thought were fun, but weird, and how when I grew up and was told what really happened, have haunted me ever since. It started when my dad's business partner came to pick me up from school. I knew him as Uncle Todd, and although I wasn't expecting him, I trusted him when he told me that my mom and dad were busy and that he was in charge of looking after me for a few days. I remember feeling kind of reluctant to get into his car, and mom and dad hadn't told me anything about it, and I didn't really want to be away from them. But he started promising me ice cream, a Game Boy, all this other fun stuff, saying mom and dad had said I could watch whatever I wanted on TV and that I was allowed to stay up until whenever I liked. Music to a kid's ear, right? So, I got into his car and we drove off to his apartment, stopping to get some ice cream on the way. Todd was serious about the TV thing too, as he pretty much left me in his apartment on my own for hours on end. I remember he seemed pretty stressed about something, but I just assumed it was like grown-up stuff or something, and I didn't really care much because I had all the Nickelodeon and McDonald's I could ever want, so I didn't think too much about it. That's how I spent the first night, and although it was also weird to me that Uncle Todd's apartment was so small that we both had to sleep in the same room, I still didn't really question anything because he was a regular part of my life and I trusted him. Then, the next day, after more McDonald's and a bunch more Nickelodeon, Uncle Todd comes back all super stressed again and tells me to go get into the bathtub. I thought he meant that I could take a bath or whatever, but that's not what he meant, as he walked me over to the bathtub and made me get inside it without any water in it and without taking any of my clothes off. I can then hear talking into the phone in the other room, trying to keep his voice down, but I could hear how angry and stressed he seemed to be at someone. But eventually he goes quiet, puts the phone down, and comes to get me out of the tub. I remember him putting me back on the bed and telling me he was going to get more McDonald's and ice cream for me. But then as he went to walk out of the room, he picked up this pokey-looking thing in his hand to obviously take it out to his car. I remember asking, "Uncle Todd, what's that?" And he told me it was a thing for getting his car started on cold mornings. I remember it wasn't even that cold that morning, or the morning before, but hey, at that age, grown-ups know best, right? Anyways, a few hours later, he drives me back to my parents' place, and they gave him a present for looking after me while they were gone. Mom and Dad seemed really happy to see me, but I was really happy to see them too. They said they missed me, and I missed them a bunch too, so I didn't really think any further into it than that. It was only when I was grown up that I was told what actually happened. You see, Uncle Todd and my dad really were business partners. But my dad wasn't exactly a good or honest person. He'd actually stolen a bunch of money from their business right under Todd's nose, and he'd actually tried to rearrange some accounting things so that Todd wouldn't notice. But Todd did notice, and Todd was really angry about it. But when he told my dad to give it back or he was going to call the cops, my dad told him that he'd already spent the money, and if he called the cops and got him thrown in jail, he was never going to get it back. Pretty scummy, I know, but my dad is generally a pretty awful person, so we won't go into that too much. But either way, Todd turned out to be way more of a psycho than my dad could have possibly figured, because instead of calling the cops and actually getting him arrested, he came up with another plan to get his money back. That's how he ended up showing up at my school and convincing me to get into his car. So, another little aspect of the story, my dad actually begged Todd not to go to the cops, hence why he basically threw out that threat that, if he did, he was never going to get the money back. He tried to give Todd all these promises that he'd pay him back and get all squared off, but Todd just didn't believe him. He wanted his money back and he wanted it soon, so he took me, let my mom and dad sweat it out for a day, and basically told them that if they didn't come up with the money in like 24 hours, that he was going to kill me. Not exactly the best plan, but like I said, Todd was way more of a psycho than anyone could have possibly imagined. He fed me McDonald's, gave me ice cream, and let me watch as much cable as I wanted, just to keep me from leaving what turned out to be a motel room. That's why, for the longest time, I just thought motels were places that people actually lived, and not places where people would rent a room only for a few days or whatever. But then there's the whole bathtub thing. Todd put me in the bathtub that day and brought an ice pack into the motel room because he was going to torture me with it while making my parents listen on the phone. That was what made them break, and they ended up selling a bunch of stuff and doing other shady stuff in order to get like 10 grand's worth of cash together in the space of almost a day. When they called to say that they had the money, Todd took me back home, took the cash, which I thought was just a gift for taking care of me, and then we never saw him again. Mom and Dad got a divorce not long after, which was sad, but a few of my friends' parents had gotten divorces too, so I knew it was a thing that moms and dads did. I had no idea it was all because of the stealing and kidnapping thing. It was also because Dad basically refused to go to the cops about what had happened because he was too scared of going to jail, that she just completely resented him for that. She also told me that he told him that if she tried to press charges against Todd, that he was going to tell the cops that she was in on the accountancy scam or whatever, and that she would end up catching charges as well. I always kind of doubted that part of it though, as surely she could just prove that she didn't have anything to do with it and it was all my dad being a scumbag. Sometimes I think she was actually part of it, and that's why she didn't just go to the cops right away when she found out that Todd had taken me. I mean, think about it. Why not report me missing straight away unless she had a good idea of what was going on and who had taken me? A lot about her side of the story doesn't add up, but since I don't see my dad anymore and Mom is like the only member of my immediate family that I'm close to, I don't really want to confront her on it too much. So yeah, that's the story of my super messed up family, and how one of the weirdest, most fun times of my childhood turned out to be something completely horrible and kind of traumatic. It seems all the scarier to me now because I had no idea what was happening to me at the time, and something that seemed innocent but kind of unusual could have turned into something out of a living nightmare, with my Uncle Todd doing all kinds of evil stuff with that ice pack, making me scream into the phone for my parents to hear. For a while, I wanted to actually confront Todd about what had happened, but we found out that he died in a car accident maybe 10 years ago now, so there's not going to be any real closure for me on that front. And like I said, I don't want to go ruining my relationship with my mom, not when I'm not really sure how long I even have left with her. I wanted to tell you the story of a friend of mine named Angel. Angel is 19 and was honestly one of the brightest, cleverest, most bubbly people I've ever met. She was obsessed with true crime stuff and would have loved your channel if she'd ever had a chance to see your videos. She loved that TV program CSI and wanted to join the police so that she could get into the forensic side of investigations. She loved the idea of using science to catch horrible criminals, but we never thought that she'd end up being the victim of one. She had everything going for her in life, but then she met her ex-boyfriend, Che, and we all saw a change in her. Che made everything about him, and he abused Angel physically and mentally until she made everything about him too. She was miserable with him, but kept talking like he was just a tortured soul who needed a girl like her in his life to help fix him. We had to intervene time and time again to get her to see that he was a scumbag who'd never be any good for anyone, as he was only ever interested in himself. And it took ages to do it, but we finally managed to convince her to leave him. She told us all in a group chat that she'd finally told him that they couldn't be together anymore, and we were all so proud of her. But she also said that she was terrified of something he'd do to get back at her for it, and as much as we knew that her dad, Patty, would never let anything happen to her while she was under his roof, we knew he couldn't protect her all the time. We also knew that Che was absolutely terrified of Patty, as they'd almost gotten into fights a few times before, and Patty is well bigger than Che and could beat the life out of him if it came to it, so we always stayed away from the house, just not far enough. I remember the day we found out that Angel was in the hospital, and we were all hoping it wasn't anything serious. But then we heard that she'd been hurt in a serious incident, and that she'd somehow fallen out of a van that was going down the highway, and we just knew that Che had something to do with it. As it turns out, Che had gotten the help of one of his friends, and they'd waited in a van near Angel's house waiting for her to come out. When they spotted her, Che ran out, picked her up, and basically carried her to the van and threw her into the back of it. We still don't know exactly what went on inside the van, but Che insisted in court that he didn't just throw her out of it. But whatever he was doing or saying, it scared Angel so much that she somehow found a way to open the back doors as it was traveling down the highway, and she must have thought her only chance at survival was jumping out the back of the van. Some people think Che pushed her out of the back as a way to kill her, but at his trial, his lawyers were somehow able to prove that Che hadn't pushed her, and all he wanted to do was keep her inside the van. He must have admitted to just wanting to kidnap and scare her into getting back with him, but I know Angel wouldn't have done anything so drastic without being scared for her life. What happened next makes it clear to me that the justice system in this country is just completely broken, because the sentence Che got was nothing on what he deserved to get. He recently got his sentence more than doubled after this big public campaign headed up by her parents, which is all good and everything, but it still feels like nothing because Angel's life is basically over now. She suffered serious head trauma after falling or being pushed from the back of the van, and now the doctors think that she's going to be potentially disabled for the rest of her life. We don't know if she's ever going to walk, talk, or eat by herself ever again. It's basically a death sentence, but the sentence Che was originally going to get was just over 4 years. Can you even believe that? A guy kidnaps his ex-girlfriend. He might have actually thrown her out the back of the van going at 60 miles an hour. Her life is now basically over, and he was probably going to get out of prison after 4 years. That's nothing. He deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life. The driver of the van got next to nothing too, and he also deserves to be in prison for the rest of his life. Angel once told me about a law in America where if someone dies while you're committing a crime, your charge automatically gets turned into murder. And I think we should have one here like that too. It would make people think twice about doing things like kidnapping or drunk driving, or anything that could end up ruining someone's life. Sorry if this seemed to get a bit emotional, or it wasn't the best written story you've been sent. I got a bit upset writing it because it's still all so raw for us all. This all happened almost 2 years ago now, but it honestly feels like yesterday that we found out that Angel's life was over. I hope you read this out in one of your videos so that more people know what a rotten scumbag Che Boskill is. He deserves to be the one lying in a hospital bed, not able to move, not Angel. I mean, he actually laughed during the court case. How can you even do that? How evil do you have to be to hear someone talking about how you took a girl's life away and then just laugh about it? Please read this out so more people hear about Angel's story. People need to know that if a guy is a psycho, it's not up to them to fix him or help him, because they'll just end up as a victim. I have a story for you, but it's not something that happened to me. It's something that happened to our neighbors back when we lived in Highgate in London. So I wasn't scared, but all the neighbors were scared for the family this was happening to, if that makes sense. Also, I've changed the man's name because my mom reckons that his parents would probably never talk to us again if they knew I told this story to a big YouTube channel like yours. Anyway, their son was taking a gap year before he went to uni, and he ended up going off to Thailand for a few months during the summer. His parents are keeping in touch with him and he seemed to be having a lot of fun, and then out of the blue, they got a phone call from some guy from Thailand. He asked them something like, "Are you Rob's parents?" And they obviously say yes, and then he tells them that Rob has been kidnapped. If they contact the police, they're going to torture and kill him. And if they don't pay them so many Thai baht, their currency, within a set time limit, they're also going to torture and kill him. Not just that, but they're going to feed his body to crocodiles or sharks or something, basically so they'd never be able to have a piece of him to bury. Pretty grim stuff, right? So Rob's mom is basically ready to get the money together, anything to keep them from hurting Rob. But his dad just gets in touch with the Thai consulate right away and he gets the police involved. This caused absolute murder with the couple, no pun intended. Like, there were some nights that you could hear them screaming at each other in the kitchen with Rob's mom screaming like, "You've killed him, you've killed our son." I mean, it got really intense like that. And just to let you know, it all ended basically okay, and Rob never got hurt or anything, but get this. Rob's dad kept telling the kidnappers that he was having trouble sending the money over to the account that they'd given him, as his bank kept flagging the transaction for fraud and refusing to send it. He played like he was more than willing to send the money, but he was just having trouble getting it sent. That way, he could buy more time for the Thai police to track the phone calls and bank account number to the person they needed to arrest. In the end, Rob's parents get another phone call from the Thai police, telling them Rob had been found safe and sound, but that he's been arrested on fraud or scamming charges or something. As insane as it sounds, Rob was never in any danger. He wasn't in some chicken wire cage or handcuffed to a bloody radiator or whatever. He was actually in on the scam himself. Long story short, he'd run out of money and was too ashamed to ask for more, so instead, he turned to some local scammers who had a proposition for him. Pretend to be kidnapped, pose for a proof of life picture, then split the ransom money 50-50 with the so-called kidnappers. Turns out it was a proper little cottage industry where he was staying, and horrible little tow-rag backpackers would sometimes scam their own parents and each other's out of maybe £1,000 at a time. The exchange rate is massive between baht and most European and American currencies, so the kids would always be like, "It's only a few £100 in our money," or whatever, and then they'd just let them go. Then the ungrateful buggers got a few more weeks of traveling in them with the money they just made. Like I might have mentioned, we don't live next to this family anymore, but as you can guess, it caused a huge rift between the kid and his parents, and I'm pretty sure it's one that still has not healed properly. I totally understand why, too. He put them through torture, all just because he was greedy and too proud to ask for money himself. Born on May 3rd of 1980 in Arcadia, California, J.C. Lee Dugard had it rough from the start. Her mother, Terry Probin, neglected to tell her father she was pregnant, so he spent the majority of his adult life ignorant of the fact that he had a daughter. Just 5 months after JC was born, her mother relocated to a small town south of Lake Tahoe named Myers and later married a man named Carl. She believed that moving out to a quiet rural setting would give her small family that peace it needed to prosper. But she couldn't have been more wrong. By the summer of 1991, Terry was working as a typesetter at a small print house, and on June 10th of that same year, she left for work early in the morning, leaving 11-year-old JC to catch the bus to school. Wearing her favorite pink outfit, JC walked out of her house, then began trudging up a nearby hill towards her regular bus stop. But when she was around halfway up, a gray Mercury Monarch pulled up alongside her, and the driver began asking her for directions. JC didn't know the area very well, so she began by apologizing to the driver. Then as she racked her brain to come up with the correct directions, the man's friendly demeanor shifted completely. He reached out of the open window, grabbed JC by the arm, then thrust the business end of a stun gun into her chest, incapacitating her before dragging her into the vehicle with him. Back at JC's home, her stepdad Carl had noticed the gray vehicle pulling up alongside her. I'm not entirely sure of the layout of the Probin house, but wherever Carl was standing, he had a view of the steep road which led to JC's bus stop. This meant he was forced to watch in absolute horror as his stepdaughter was tased and abducted right before his eyes. He rushed to a bicycle he kept near the front door and proceeded to pedal after the gray Mercury as fast as he could. But it was no good. The car sped off out of sight, and JC was gone. Within just a few hours of JC's disappearance, journalists from both local and national media outlets were buzzing around the sleepy streets of Meyer like flies around a corpse. They interviewed JC's distraught parents, as well as local school children who had also witnessed the gray Mercury speeding off towards a nearby highway. A few days later, the entirety of Southern California was plastered with flyers and missing posters depicting JC's likeness, and Meyer became adorned with ribbons in JC's signature pink as a show of support for her heartbroken family. Terry Probin quickly founded an organization known as JC's Hope, which accepted donations to fuel the search for her missing daughter, and the group also received financial and material aid from the likes of Child Quest International and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. JC's case was also featured on an episode of the television show America's Most Wanted, and although the episode generated dozens of tips and leads, not a single one led to JC's safe recovery. Police initially suspected that JC's biological father, Ken Slayton, might have been to blame for her abduction, and went to interview him in connection with her disappearance. Little did they know, but Ken had no idea he was even a father, and the revelation was nothing short of heart-wrenching to him. Not only had he spent the last 11 years being completely unaware of his daughter's existence, but he had been incapable of protecting her when she needed it most. In order to determine if he was telling the truth, the police subjected Ken to several polygraph tests, but since he passed each and every one of them, they were forced to rule him out as a suspect. However, without Ken Slayton as their main suspect, the police had no idea who might be responsible for Casey's abduction, and after years of false leads and investigative dead ends, they were forced to divert their attention elsewhere, and the case of Casey's abduction became a cold one. 18 years later, on August 24th of 2009, a man walked into the San Francisco office of the FBI with an envelope in his hand. He handed it to a bemused secretary, telling her the envelope's contents were of the utmost importance. The envelope then found its way onto the desk of an FBI agent, and when opened, they found it contained a 4-page essay detailing the nature of religion and how certain criminal behavioral problems could be solved by subjecting the perpetrators to intense sessions of Bible study. A few hours later, the same unhinged writer walked onto the campus of the University of California, seeking an appointment with the special events manager. With him were 2 young women that he claimed were his daughters, but the event manager harbored some rather sinister suspicions. Lisa Campbell later stated that the girls seemed sullen and submissive, and were so pale that it was as if they'd not seen sunlight in quite some time. Campbell then contacted the head of campus police, who in turn ran a background check on the man in question, who told them that his name was Philip Garrido. That's how they discovered that Garrido was a registered offender who was on federal parole for kidnapping and assault. Not only was Garrido barred from associating with minors, but traveling to Berkeley exceeded the 25-mile limit he was allowed to travel from his home without his parole agent's permission. Having broken his parole conditions, 2 federal agents paid a visit to Garrido's home on the island of Antioch in Contra Costa County. Garrido was briefly questioned, then ordered to accompany the 2 pale and timid girls to a parole office in nearby Concord on August 26th. Garrido did as he was told and arrived at the parole office with his wife, Nancy, and a young woman he introduced as Alyssa. Alyssa told investigators that although she was aware of Garrido's status as an offender, that he was a great person, a changed man, and that he was good with her kids. Alyssa was then asked if she had any documentation which could prove her identity, and she suddenly became very defensive and cagey. When asked why she might react in such a way to such a simple request, Alyssa claimed that she was an abused spouse from Minnesota who was hiding from her abusive husband. Investigators then tried to corroborate this story with Garrido and pressed him on why he'd told the Berkeley special events manager that Alyssa was his daughter, before quickly changing his story that she was the daughter of a friend. He too became defensive and agitated, and when the police demanded to see some kind of identification belonging to Alyssa, Garrido broke down and told them the truth. Alyssa wasn't his daughter, nor was she the daughter of a friend. She wasn't from Minnesota, she wasn't an abused spouse, and in truth, her name wasn't even Alyssa. Her real name was J.C. Lee Duggard. Only when she was confronted with Garrido's confession did J.C. admit who she was, and after a brief phone call with her mother, the first in 18 long years, she began telling police officers the story of her own mysterious abduction. After being taken back to Garrido's home, J.C. was kept prisoner in a small, soundproof shed that Philip and Nancy Garrido had constructed in their backyard. She was then told that if she tried to escape, some specially trained Dobermans would rip her to shreds before she even got near the backyard fence. A few hours later, Philip Garrido forced J.C. to shower with him, grooming her for what was to be 18 years of pure torture. Just a week later, Garrido subjected J.C. to the first of many assaults and told her that if she behaved herself and didn't struggle, that she would be allowed to eat. As time went by, J.C. was rewarded for her submission with a TV to keep her entertained, yet the Garridos had carefully disabled access to any kind of news channel so that J.C. would be unaware of the ongoing search for her. Eventually, Garrido further rewarded J.C. by allowing her to live in a small bedroom, albeit constantly handcuffed to the bed it contained. Garrido then told her that she was only abducted because certain demon angels had allowed him to do so, and her purpose was to help solve the problem he had with his libido, problems that he claimed society had largely ignored. He sometimes dressed her up, put makeup on her, then spent time making her cut figures out of adult magazines. He also told her to listen to the walls of her bedroom because if she strained her ears, she too would be able to hear the voice Garrido could hear talking to him. He told J.C. that these voices told him how he was the chosen servant of God, and it appears these beliefs were fueled by rampant methamphetamine binges which further separated him from both reality and sanity. Sometimes, Garrido would break down into tears and apologize to J.C. for all that he'd put her through. Other times, he would become violent and abusive, telling her that he would sell her to other people if she didn't behave, people who wouldn't be nearly so nice as he was. Around 5 or 6 months into her captivity, Garrido introduced J.C. to his wife, Nancy, who took pleasure in mothering the child by bringing her stuffed animals or chocolate milk. Yet despite the veneer of motherly love, J.C. later said that Nancy was just as evil and twisted as her husband, and took charge of brainwashing until she stopped using the name JC to identify herself. JC also said that, at one point, Nancy had brought her a kitten as a reward for what she called good behavior. But when JC began asking about her family, Nancy had somehow made the kitten disappear. Nancy also flat out refused to let JC see any kind of medical professional, and that her health drastically suffered as a result. Just over 3 years into her captivity, after being assaulted at least once a week, JC found that Philip and Nancy were suddenly acting rather differently around her. On April 3rd of 1994, they fed her a home-cooked meal for the first time, and began allowing her freedom from her handcuffs for brief periods of time. Shortly after this bizarre shift in behavior, 13-year-old JC was told that she might be pregnant with Philip's child. Then, on August 18th of 1994, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. 3 years later, she would give birth to a second. After the birth of her children, JC coped with the prolonged captivity by homeschooling her daughters and tending a small flower garden with them. Yet in a move that only the most depraved of villains could conjure up, the Garridos found a way to turn JC's own children into a cudgel to beat her with. They told her that both she and her daughters were to refer to Nancy Garrido as mother, and that JC would teach her daughters that Nancy was their biological mother, while she was their older sister. JC was then told that if she failed to comply, both she and her daughters would be killed. By this point, JC was either so brainwashed or so terrified of losing her daughters that even when she had ample opportunity to do so, she made no attempt to rescue herself. Even when she began working in Philip Garrido's print shop, where she had access to both a telephone and an email account, she never once indicated to anyone that she had been kidnapped as a young girl before being raised in captivity. Yet it wasn't just what they later referred to as Stockholm Syndrome that was to blame for JC's prolonged captivity, as there seemed to have been several instances of what law enforcement called missed opportunities. Police not only failed to make the connection that JC was kidnapped south of Lake Tahoe, the same area as Philip Garrido's previous kidnapping offense, but in April of 1992, less than a year after she was taken, a legitimate sighting of JC failed to be seized upon. On April 22nd, a man called the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Department from a gas station less than 2 miles from where JC was being held. This man told police that he was almost certain he'd spotted JC Dugard at the gas station he was at, and he had been staring intently at a missing child poster of herself. The caller then reported seeing a man taking her away in a large yellow Dodge van. Sadly, the caller had been unable to make a note of the van's license plate, and by the time police arrived, it was long gone. Yet for some reason, there was no police follow-up on this call whatsoever. Then, in 2009, following JC's recovery, an old yellow Dodge van was recovered from the Garrido property, one that was matching the exact description of the one spotted in 1992. On top of that, in 2006, one of Philip Garrido's neighbors called 911 to inform them that children seemed to be living in tents in the backyard, and that Garrido was acting psychotic. A deputy sheriff then drove out to the property and conversed with Garrido for over 30 minutes, telling him that there would be a code violation if people were living outside on the property. Not once did he even ask to enter the backyard to talk to the children living there. In addition, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation definitely deserves to shoulder some of the blame. They erroneously classified Garrido as needing only low-level supervision, and it can be reasonably argued that this was the mother of all their mistakes. At one point, an inspector detailed an instance in which a parole agent encountered a 12-year-old girl at the home, but accepted Garrido's explanation that she was his niece and did absolutely nothing to confirm it, even after discovering that Garrido had no nieces. Time and time again, the California authorities wasted chances to rescue JC from her fate, and so she was forced to employ alternative methods in order to survive. In 2016, broadcast journalist Diane Sawyer conducted an interview with JC and suggested that she may have been suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. In response, JC replied, Stockholm Syndrome implies that hostages cracked by terror and abuse become affectionate towards their captors. But it's really degrading having my family believe that I was in love with this captor and wanted to stay with him. I mean, that is so far from the truth that it makes me want to throw up. I adapted to survive my circumstances. I did what I did so I could survive. Needless to say, JC's reunion with her mother was an extremely emotional one, and thankfully, it seems that her 2 children had suffered almost no negative effects of growing up in captivity. JC's aunt Tina once said that the children are clever, articulate, curious girls, and despite their bizarre upbringing, they've always seemed healthy and well-adjusted. Unbelievably, when charged with their horrific actions, the Garridos pled not guilty on all counts of kidnap, false imprisonment, and indecent assault. Philip Garrido in particular claimed that in the end, this is going to be a powerful, heartwarming story. My life has been straightened out. When you hear this story of what took place at this house, you're going to be absolutely impressed. It's a disgusting thing that took place with me at the beginning, but I turned my life completely around. Garrido seemed to think that he basically would be able to talk himself out of the charges by helping the FBI prevent future kidnapping incidents, and cited the 4-page essay that he'd given their San Francisco office in August of 2009. It was only when Nancy Garrido was faced with a 241-year jail sentence that Philip Garrido changed his plea, and while he was sentenced to 431 years, his cooperation meant that Nancy was only sentenced to 36. Since their imprisonment, JC has begun an intensive course of animal therapy, which emphasizes the therapeutic nature of interaction with animals as a way of healing past traumas. She undertakes this therapy with her mother Terry and her sister Shayna, and is said to respond best to interactions with horses. News of her rescue prompted public statements from other survivors of kidnap and abuse, most notably Sean Hornbeck and Elizabeth Smart. Hornbeck commented that coming out of what she's had to endure is like entering a new world. It's like a door is open for her and she's emerged from a world that's black and white into one that's full of color. She was brainwashed. She'll probably feel angry, but now she needs to move on with her life. Elizabeth Smart, on the other hand, stressed the importance of focusing on the future with a positive attitude as an effective approach to accepting what has happened. Those are undoubtedly some wise words from a woman who suffered a very similar trauma in her life, and it's advice we can all take in reference to moving on from the things that haunt us. If someone like JC can move on from 18 years of pure torture, then I'd like to think that we too are capable of surviving what haunts us the most. Stephen Stainer was born as the third of Delbert and Kay Stainer's 5 children in Merced, California on April 18th of 1965. By all accounts, Stephen had a happy childhood, and both his parents and siblings cared for him deeply. He and his brother often went exploring the nearby Yosemite National Park, and for a while, he had the kind of childhood that most of us can only dream of. Yet when he was 7 years old, Stephen suffered through something that can only be described as a living nightmare, and to say it had a destructive effect on his older brother might be the understatement of the century. When his schooling convened on the afternoon of December 4th, 1972, Stephen Stainer began the short walk back to his childhood home. At some point in the journey, he was approached by a kindly-looking stranger who claimed to be collecting donations for a nearby church. Stephen didn't have any money to give, but the man claimed this was no problem and handed Stephen a small piece of paper that displayed a short Bible verse. It's understandable that this would generate a degree of trust between Stephen and the stranger, as he was raised to believe that men who followed the scriptures were good people. The man then asked Stephen if he thought his mother might be willing to donate to the church, and when the young boy replied in the affirmative, the man offered to give Stephen a ride back home so he could ask her. At that, a white Buick pulled up next to the pair, driven by a man that the stranger referred to as his minister. Again, it seems Stephen had no reason to distrust the man, and as he climbed into the back seat of the Buick, he believed the men were about to drive him straight home. But soon, Stephen began to realize that he didn't recognize the roads the men were driving along, and it quickly dawned on him that he wasn't being given a ride home as they'd promised. He was being kidnapped. Stephen was taken to a cabin in the nearby Cathy's Valley, and the abuse began on the very first night. He was told repeatedly that if he behaved himself, he would be allowed to return home, but this was nothing but a lie his captors told him in order to keep him obedient. Then after a while, the men told Stephen another lie, explaining that they had been granted legal custody of him as his parents could not afford so many children. They told him his name was no longer Stephen Gregory Stainer, but rather Dennis Gregory Parnell, and over time, Stephen began to believe that his parents no longer wanted him. Obviously, there was an extensive search for the boy taking place, but the men who'd abducted him somehow managed to keep him completely insulated from it. They frequently moved the boy around California, enrolling Stephen in different schools while keeping him relatively sheltered from the outside world. After a year in captivity, Stephen no longer saw himself as a prisoner of the two men, as he was given a great deal of freedom, including the freedom to drink alcohol, and he was also given a dog to look after. It's believed the Manchester Terrier, who was named Queenie, was a well-thought-out attempt to keep Stephen anchored to his captors. He couldn't bear to abandon Queenie, and even if he did realize that people were looking for him, he simply had no idea how to summon the appropriate help. The last part is taken straight from Stephen's own account of his kidnapping, and while it might seem surreal and almost unbelievable that a boy of 9 wouldn't know how to call 911, we have to keep in mind that he was seriously abused by his captors, and that under their guidance, reality was a fluid and shifting concept. When Stephen entered puberty, his captors began searching for a younger boy to kidnap and abuse, and Stephen was so mentally broken by them that, shockingly, he actually aided in the attempts to find one. Stephen later said that his failure to successfully kidnap anyone was down to his own deliberate sabotage. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he was too afraid of his captors to openly defy them. In fact, Stephen was actually building up to an escape attempt, and it was the successful kidnapping of 5-year-old Timmy White that finally pushed him over the edge. On March 1st of 1980, while the lead captor was away at a night security job, Stephen took young Timmy by the hand and they hitchhiked into Ukiah, California to hand the young boy over to the local sheriff. Once they arrived at the department, Stephen told them everything, including how he himself was kidnapped 7 years previously. Sheriff's deputies immediately drove out to the place the two boys were being held, just in time for the man who'd taken them to arrive home from work. When they put the cuffs on him and rummaged through his pockets to locate some form of ID, the name on it read Kenneth Eugene Parnell. Kenneth was born in Texas during the Great Depression, but his mother had later moved the family out to Bakersfield, California after Kenneth's father had abandoned them. He spent much of his adolescence in and out of juvenile hall and mental institutions and was arrested in 1951 for impersonating a police officer to abuse a young boy. He later claimed that he kidnapped and abused the boy because his wife was pregnant and that he, quote-unquote, had to find another outlet. Kenneth was eventually tried and convicted of kidnapping both Stephen Stainer as well as young Timmy White, but only ended up serving 5 years of his 7-year prison sentence. This was said to have had a terrible effect on Stephen, who believed that a truly evil man had basically gotten away with ruining his entire life. After being reunited with his family, Stephen had a great deal of trouble readjusting to normal life. In captivity, he had been severely neglected, and his birth parents were incredibly protective and overbearing in comparison. In an interview with Newsweek, which took place shortly after his escape, Stephen commented that, "I returned almost a grown man, yet my parents saw me at first as their 7-year-old. After they stopped trying to teach me all the fundamentals all over again, it got better. But why doesn't my dad hug me anymore? Everything has changed. Sometimes I blame myself. I don't know sometimes if I should have come home." Would I have been better off if I didn't? Stephen attended a few therapy sessions organized by his parents, but refused to discuss the abuse that he'd suffered at Kenneth Parnell's hands. What's more, his father seemed to be in complete denial, refusing to admit that Stephen might be in need of some serious psychotherapy. Stephen began to drink heavily, and his relationship with his parents became highly strained as a result. In the end, Stephen's father kicked him out of the family home, forcing him to make his way in the world alone. By age 20, Stephen had married a young woman by the name of Jody Edmondson, and the couple would go on to have 2 children together, Ashley and Stephen Jr. Stephen made a living by working with various child abduction groups and would visit schools to discuss personal safety with the students. He joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and supported his family by working in a Merced pizza place. But tragically, on September 16th of 1989, Stephen was driving his motorcycle home from work when it collided with a car. He suffered catastrophic head injuries, and although EMTs rushed him to a hospital in less than an hour, he was declared dead on arrival. More than 500 people attended his funeral, and a then 14-year-old Timmy White featured as a pallbearer. It was a heart-wrenching end to Stephen's story, but the stories of Kenneth Parnell and Stephen's family were far from over. In January of 2003, Kenneth was once again arrested on abuse-related charges after trying to convince one of his caregivers to buy him a 4-year-old boy. Kenneth was almost 72 years old at this point, suffering from both diabetes and emphysema, and his extremely poor health meant he required round-the-clock nursing care in his ramshackle apartment in Berkeley, California. The caregiver was a woman by the name of Diane Stevens, and Diane was acutely aware of Kenneth's evil past. As such, she immediately reported his request to the police and would eventually cooperate in setting up the sting operation that would lead to his arrest. On February 9th of 2004, Kenneth was convicted of attempting to purchase a child, as well as attempted abuse. The prosecution argued that illicit materials found in the apartment were evidence that Kenneth's intentions toward any child were criminal in nature, and as a result, Kenneth was sentenced to 25 years to life. He remained in prison until his eventual death in 2008, which apparently came about as a result of natural causes. Bizarrely, the only other person eviler than Kenneth turned out to be Stephen's older brother, Cary Stayner, who was said to be so affected by his brother's abuse and death that he grew up to be one of California's most notorious serial killers. In 2002, Cary was convicted of murdering 4 women between February and July of 1999 and was eventually sentenced to death for his crimes. During the sentencing hearing, Cary Stayner stunned the watching courtroom when he suddenly began sobbing. "I wish I could take it back, but I can't," he said. "I wish I could tell you why I did such a thing, but I don't even know myself. I'm so sorry. I wish there was a reason, but there isn't. It's senseless." I believe there is a reason. I believe that Stephen's kidnapping and abuse at the hands of Kenneth Parnell had a ripple effect on those who surrounded the case. All that senseless torment, pain, and neglect echoed back on Cary, who simply reflected it all back onto a world that he didn't understand. I'm not saying Cary is totally blameless for his actions, as they are undoubtedly of pure evil. But without his brother's kidnap, without the deep sorrow it imposed on his family, maybe Cary wouldn't have sought out those poor women whose lives he snatched away. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below, friends. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, keep my wife's name out your mouth.